The streets of Jerusalem hummed with a restless, jagged energy that vibrated against the stone walls. It was a morning defined by the sound of iron on rock. Soldiers moved in locked rhythmic patterns, their boots striking the ground with a cold, mechanical precision that silenced the usual bustle of the market. Dust rose in thick, swirling clouds, catching the early light and hanging in the air like a physical weight. Every corner of the city felt tight, as if the very foundations were bracing for a sudden, violent shift. People pressed themselves into doorways, eyes darting toward the sound of the approaching patrols, their movements hurried and frantic. The air tasted of dry earth and old metal, thick enough to choke the breath from the lungs. There was no room for hesitation here. The city was a coiled spring, held down by the sheer force of the occupation. Inside the governor's hall, the atmosphere grew even heavier. The scent of dust mingled with the sharp, metallic tang of impending conflict. The guards stood motionless, their hands resting on the hilts of their weapons, waiting for a signal. Outside, the roar of the crowd began to swell, a singular, bloodthirsty sound that echoed off the city gates and rattled the shutters of every home. The tension was absolute. Inside the hall, the atmosphere shifted from the roar of the streets to a sharp, biting intensity. Jesus stood at the center of the stone floor, his wrists bound by coarse fraying rope that bit into his skin with every slight movement. The council members paced the perimeter, their shadows stretching long and jagged against the walls as they circled him. Accusations flew like arrows, sharp and rapid, each one punctuated by a fist slamming onto the wooden table or a finger pointed in a sudden violent arc. They leaned in close, their breath ragged, faces twisted as they demanded a response. Yet, Jesus did not shift his weight. He watched the horizon through a high, narrow slit in the wall, his eyes steady, unblinking, and entirely detached from the frantic energy surrounding him. The council members faltered, their voices momentarily losing rhythm against his silence. They stepped back, then surged forward again. He stood as a pillar of calm in a room rapidly losing its grip on logic, his focus fixed on a point far beyond the reach of their anger. The silence inside the hall snapped like dry timber. It began as a low vibration, a rhythmic thrumming that rattled the heavy wooden doors and sent dust cascading from the rafters. The council members froze, their heads turning toward the sound. Outside, the city had reached a breaking point. The roar was not a single voice, but a tidal wave of sound that crashed against the stone walls, shaking the very foundations of the building. Thousands of feet shifted in the courtyard, a chaotic, shuffling mass of movement that drowned out the last remnants of order. The air grew thick with the scent of sweat and heated stone. Then, the chanting started. It was a singular, bloodthirsty sound. "Crucify him." The words hit the walls with the force of physical blows. Faces pressed against the iron grates of the gates, eyes wide and frantic, mouths open in a collective, jagged scream. The mob surged forward, a sea of limbs and desperate, twisted expressions, pushing against the guards who struggled to hold the line. The governor looked toward the doors, his expression hardening as the sound reached a deafening crescendo. The decision was no longer his to make. The heavy doors swung open, and the guards did not wait for a command. They lunged forward, hands gripping his arms with bruising force, and hauled him toward the courtyard. The transition was violent. One moment, he was standing in the dim, stale air of the hall. The next, he was shoved into the blinding glare of the morning sun. The courtyard floor was uneven, littered with loose gravel and dust that puffed up around his feet as they dragged him across the center. The guards shoved him against a stone pillar, their movements sharp, practiced, and devoid of hesitation. A guard stepped back, his hand moving to the handle of the whip. The air in the courtyard seemed to thin, the roar of the crowd outside muffled by the sudden, suffocating anticipation of the guards. Then, the first strike landed. The sound was a sharp, wet crack that echoed off the surrounding walls, cutting through the morning stillness like a blade. It was followed by another and another, a rhythmic, mechanical cadence of violence. Each strike landed with enough force to knock a man to his knees. Yet, he remained upright. He did not cry out. The guards stopped their rhythmic assault, their chests heaving with exertion. They looked at each other, then back at him, their expressions shifting from mechanical duty to a dark, inventive cruelty. One guard stepped away, his boots crunching over the scattered debris near the wall. He knelt, his fingers working through a pile of dry, twisted branches scavenged from the courtyard edge. He pulled a cluster of long, needle-sharp thorns from the tangle, his movements deliberate and slow. He began to weave them together, twisting the brittle wood until it formed a jagged, circular band. The sound of the wood snapping echoed in the sudden, heavy silence of the courtyard. He stood and walked back, holding the ring of thorns with both hands. He did not hesitate. He stepped forward and pressed the circle down onto his brow with a sudden, downward shove. The thorns resisted, then tore through the surface of the skin. The sound of wood grating against bone was faint, but unmistakable. He did not flinch, though his head bowed slightly under the pressure. The guard twisted the band, ensuring the points bit deep into the flesh. A single, dark droplet welled up at the temple, then another. They traced slow, deliberate paths down his cheeks, gathering weight before falling. Each drop struck the dry, gray dust at his feet, leaving a small, dark stain that spread instantly. The guards stepped back, watching the crimson bloom in the dirt, their faces twisted in a mixture of confusion and malice. The guards did not wait for the blood to stop flowing. One of them signaled to the others, and they moved toward the corner of the courtyard where the timber lay discarded. It was a massive, rough-hewn beam, splintered and stained from years of use. They dragged it across the stone, the wood scraping with a harsh, grinding sound. They reached him and shoved the beam forward, forcing it onto his shoulders. The impact was immediate and brutal. The weight of the timber slammed down, driving him toward the earth. His knees buckled under the sudden, crushing pressure. He fell forward, his hands striking the grit of the courtyard floor to break the momentum. The wood pressed into the soft tissue of his shoulders, the rough grain tearing at the skin. He remained there for a moment, the beam pinning him to the ground, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. The guards stood over him, their shadows looming large. He did not stay down. He shifted his weight, planting his feet firmly into the dust. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the edges of the wood. With a slow, grinding effort, he pushed himself upright. He stood, swaying slightly, the beam now a permanent extension of his frame. He looked ahead, his jaw set. The gate opened with a slow, grinding protest of iron against stone. He stepped out of the courtyard and onto the path that led upward. The road was a jagged spine of loose gravel and packed earth, winding steadily toward the horizon. Each step was a calculated negotiation with gravity. The beam bit deeper into his shoulders with every movement, the rough wood dragging against the raw skin. He walked with a heavy, rhythmic gait, his boots crunching into the dust. The incline grew steeper, the path narrowing as it snaked toward the summit. A sudden patch of loose shale shifted beneath his right foot. He lurched, the massive weight of the timber swinging violently, threatening to pull him down into the dirt. He slammed his left foot into the ground, locking his knee to arrest the momentum. He stood there for a heartbeat, chest heaving, the wood vibrating against his back. The air was thick with the scent of dry earth and stagnant heat. He did not look back. He shifted the weight, adjusted his grip on the rough grain, and took another step, then another. The path was long, and the summit remained a distant, blurred silhouette. His eyes remained fixed on the path ahead, each movement a deliberate, grueling act of will that defied the exhaustion radiating through his limbs. The path ended at the summit, a flat expanse of jagged rock and dust. They did not wait. The soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, forcing him down onto the timber. The rough wood bit into his back, the surface cold and unyielding against his skin. He did not resist. The first strike of the hammer rang out, a sharp, metallic crack that echoed across the hill. It was followed by another, then another. the sound of iron piercing flesh and wood vibrating through the still air. The crowd, which had been a constant, low-frequency roar, suddenly went silent. The only sound left was the rhythmic, brutal percussion of the hammer. They hoisted the cross upward, the weight shifting as it rose against the horizon. It swung for a moment, before dropping into the pre-cut hole. The sky began to bruise, the blue draining away to be replaced by a deep, unnatural purple. The world held its breath. The silence was not empty. It was a heavy, physical weight that settled over the summit. The jeers that had fueled the climb evaporated, leaving only the sound of ragged breathing and the distant, rhythmic clatter of armor. The soldiers stood back, wiping sweat and dust from their brows, their faces masks of hardened indifference. They looked up, expecting a cry of pain or a final, desperate curse. Instead, the air remained still. Jesus shifted, his body straining against the wood, the muscles in his arms corded, white and rigid, as he pulled himself up to draw a deeper breath. He looked down, not at the soldiers, but through them, his gaze sweeping across the sea of faces gathered at the base of the hill. His voice was low, yet it carried across the jagged rock with a clarity that silenced the wind. "Father, forgive them," he whispered. The words hung in the air, fragile and steady. "They do not know what they are doing." The soldiers froze, their hands hovering near their hilts. The silence on the hill was absolute, broken only by the shallow, rattling breaths of the dying. To the left, the thief hung slumped, his head lolling against the rough timber. He had been cursing the soldiers for hours, his voice a jagged rasp of hate. But as the echo of the plea for forgiveness faded into the cooling air, he stopped. He turned his head, the movement slow and agonizing, his neck muscles straining against the wood. His eyes, rimmed with red and clouded by pain, locked onto the figure beside him. He saw the way the weight was held, the stillness that defied the trauma of the nails. A sudden sharp clarity cut through his delirium. He stopped fighting the restraints. He stopped gasping for air. "Remember me," the thief rasped, his voice barely audible above the wind. The plea was stripped of all pretense, a raw, final request. Jesus turned his head. There was no judgment in the look, only a faint, steady light that seemed to burn through the gathering gloom. "Today," Jesus said, his voice firm and resonant, "you will be with me in paradise." The thief let out a long, shuddering breath, his body relaxing against the cross. The terror that had gripped his face dissolved, replaced by a strange, quiet peace that held firm even as the world around them began to darken. The light did not fade gradually. It was stripped away. A wall of thick, charcoal clouds surged across the horizon, swallowing the sun, and plunging the hill into a premature, suffocating twilight. The temperature plummeted. On the ground, the onlookers pulled their arms tight against their chests, their eyes darting toward the sky. Then, the earth groaned. It was a low, guttural rumble that started deep beneath the rock, vibrating through the soles of their feet and rattling the timber of the crosses. The soldiers gripped their spears, their knuckles white, as the ground pulsed with a rhythmic, unnatural force. Jesus hung in the center of the darkness, his head bowed, his chest heaving with the effort of every shallow intake of air. The tremors intensified, shaking loose stones from the ridge. He lifted his head, his eyes fixed on the void above the city. He drew a final, ragged breath, pulling his body against the iron, and shouted into the gloom, "It is finished!" The sound tore through the heavy air, sharp and absolute. His head dropped forward. The tension in his shoulders vanished. His body went limp against the wood, the weight pulling him downward. The rumble beneath the earth ceased instantly. The silence on the hill was heavy, a vacuum that pulled at the senses. Miles away, in the heart of the city, the temple stood in its usual, rigid order. The inner sanctuary was shielded by a veil of immense thickness, woven from heavy dyed threads that had hung undisturbed for generations. The air inside the temple was stagnant, smelling of incense and old stone. Then, the atmosphere changed. A pressure built within the chamber, pressing against the walls and the floor. The heavy fabric of the veil began to ripple, though no wind touched it. It pulled taut, the thread straining against the iron rings that secured it to the ceiling. A sharp, rhythmic snapping sound echoed through the hall as the first fibers gave way. Then, the fabric split. It did not fray from the bottom up. It tore from the very top, a clean, violent line that raced downward with the sound of thunder. The heavy material parted, folding back like wounded wings. The inner sanctuary, once hidden and forbidden, lay suddenly exposed to the outer court. The light from the lamps spilled out across the floor, illuminating the space where no man had dared to tread. The barrier was gone. The destruction did not stop at the temple. The tremor that had begun as a low vibration beneath the city's streets surged into a violent, rhythmic upheaval. Stone pavers in the marketplace buckled, rising and falling like waves on a dark sea. The mortar between the heavy blocks of the city walls groaned, then crumbled, sending showers of dust and grit into the air. In the narrow alleys, the stone foundations of houses shifted, causing walls to lean and rafters to snap with the sound of gunshots. The ground beneath the feet of the onlookers split open. A jagged fissure tore through the main thoroughfare, widening until it swallowed the carts and stalls left in the panic. People scrambled for balance, their hands clawing at the shifting earth. But the ground offered no stability. The tremors intensified, a relentless grinding force that turned the solid city into a landscape of moving rubble. Dust rose in thick, suffocating clouds, obscuring the horizon and turning the afternoon into a gray, choking haze. The violent grinding of the earth ceased as abruptly as it had begun. A heavy, suffocating silence rushed back into the void, pressing down on the hill like a physical weight. The dust began to settle, coating the jagged rocks and the splintered wood. A Roman soldier stood near the base of the hill, his grip tight on the shaft of his spear. He had seen the carnage of a dozen campaigns, but the stillness now felt sharper than any blade. He looked up at the center cross. The sky above had bruised into a deep, unnatural purple, casting long, distorted shadows across the terrain. The soldier's knuckles were white against the wood of his weapon. His breath hitched, a ragged sound in the quiet. He looked at the man on the cross, then at the fractured rock beneath his own feet. The spear slipped from his fingers, clattering against the stone, with a hollow, metallic ring that echoed into the distance. He did not reach to retrieve it. He stood frozen, his gaze locked on the figure above. "Surely," he muttered, "this was the Son of God." Around him, the crowd recoiled, the earlier bloodlust replaced by a cold, creeping dread. The sun did not set. It was erased. Thick, charcoal clouds rolled over the horizon, knitting together into a seamless wall that blotted out every trace of light. The transition was absolute. Within minutes, the afternoon heat bled away, replaced by a damp, biting chill that clung to the skin. In the city, the bustling markets went cold. Merchants abandoned their stalls, leaving goods scattered in the dirt as they retreated into the shadows. The streets, usually alive with the rhythmic clatter of carts and the shouts of traders, fell into a profound, hollow stillness. No birds sang. The darkness was not merely an absence of light. It was a physical barrier, thick and suffocating, that pressed against the windows and doors. People huddled in their rooms, lighting oil lamps that flickered weakly against the oppressive gloom. The hours bled into one another. For 3 days, the city remained suspended in this unnatural shroud. Time seemed to have stalled, caught in the grip of a silent, waiting void. Uncertainty hung in the air, a cold, static weight that left the city breathless, waiting for a dawn that refused to break. The darkness held its grip until the final hour of the third day. Then, the earth shuddered. A low, rhythmic vibration began deep beneath the limestone, rattling the jars of oil and the wooden frames of the nearby dwellings. The vibration sharpened into a violent, localized tremor. At the mouth of the tomb, the massive, circular stone seal groaned, It shifted, the jagged edges scraping against the rock face with a sound like grinding teeth. Dust billowed out as the stone rolled, gathering momentum until it struck the earth with a final, heavy thud. The space behind it, previously sealed in absolute shadow, was suddenly exposed. The air inside was still, smelling of dry linen and cold stone. The burial slab sat bare. The linen wrappings lay discarded in a heap, flattened and empty. There was no body. The space where death had claimed its prize was now vacant, the silence replaced by the faint, distant sound of wind returning to the valley. Light, thin and pale, spilled across the threshold of the tomb. The stone stood pushed aside, marking the end of the long, suffocating wait. The tomb remained open, a jagged gap in the limestone that refused to close. It was no longer a destination, but a point of departure. Beyond the hill, the cross stood firm, its timber weathered by the wind and the grit of the valley. It was not merely a relic of a singular event. It functioned as a bridge, spanning the distance between the broken and the redeemed. Where the earth had split and the veil had torn, a path now emerged. It was a physical route through the wreckage of the past. For those standing in the debris of their own lives, the cross offered a way forward. It did not erase the history of the struggle, but it provided the footing to move across the divide. The wood, once stained with the dust of the city, now served as a permanent anchor. The path was narrow, carved into the rock, leading away from the silence of the grave toward the horizon. The cross is not an idea that fades with the setting sun. It is a promise etched into the bedrock of history, as tangible as the stone of the hill itself. It remains fixed, a permanent marker in the timeline of the world. While empires rise and fall and the city streets change their shape, the event on that summit stands immovable. It is a promise that does not rely on the shifting moods of the crowd or the passing of the seasons. It is a historical fact, recorded in the dust and the rock, waiting for anyone to walk the path it defines. This is not a concept for the abstract mind. It is a reality for the traveler on the road. The promise is written in the very history of that hill, a document signed in the aftermath of the struggle. It exists as a constant, a reference point that does not move when the world shakes. The promise is as solid as the timber. If you find yourself lost in the shadows, look to the cross. It is the point where the heaviest moment of the past transformed into the first light of the morning. The darkness that once held the world has retreated, leaving behind a clear path. The sun rises over the hill, illuminating the stone and the timber, turning the site of the struggle into the start of a new life. This is not a distant memory. It is a current reality. The light that broke the silence on that day still reaches across the years. It hits the ground where you stand, warming the earth and revealing the way forward. The weight of the past has been lifted, and the horizon is no longer a barrier, but an opening. Step out from the shadow of the hill. The night is over, the dawn is here, and the path is clear for you to walk into the day.